afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 8th Annual Wildfire Symposium. This is our first virtual symposium thanks to COVID considerations, but we are very grateful that everyone has been able to join us today to participate. This symposium is brought to you through a collaboration between the AFD Wildfire Division and the Austin-Travis County Wildfire Coalition, in addition to the contributions provided by our esteemed speakers and participants today from all over the country. Our theme for this year is From At Risk to Empowered, and our hope is that all participants will leave the symposium today with information and activities they can incorporate into their lives and communities to feel empowered against the risk they may face in their area. My name is Carrie Stewart, and I will be your facilitator for the afternoon. I've been with AFD for 21 years, and I've had the opportunity to work with the Wildfire Division for the last year and a half. It's been an incredible learning adventure, and I'm honored to work with all of the men and the women within the Wildfire Division and throughout our community who are dedicated to keeping our area safe and resilient from unwanted wildfire activity. We have a few housekeeping considerations before we start. First of all, we recommend that you log in using a computer that's been working better than logging in on a mobile device. We also have a question and answer box if you have a question. We're encouraging everyone to type questions into that area that can be found in the bottom right of your screen. It says Q&A. So please, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask throughout the symposium, please text those in, and we'll be answering those as we go. And if we have any left, we'll address those at the end of the symposium. We do have the chat turned off for this session, so if you do have questions or concerns, use that Q&A section. For all of our attendees, we're controlling the microphones behind the scenes, so don't think anything's wrong with that function. We are controlling it on the back side. And we're also going to have some polls to participate in as we go
behind the scene
throughout the symposium. So please participate in those polls. Those will be found on the right side of your screen where that star is, and they'll be open for about a minute when each one is presented. And finally, we'll be recording the symposium if you'd like the opportunity to review it later, and we'll let you know how you're going to get that recording as we near the end of the symposium. So to start us off, we're going to go into poll number 1. So we just want to know a little bit about our attendees and what drives their interest in attending today. And we'll be sharing those results, but you'll have about a minute to take that poll. And I'm going to, while everybody's doing that, go over the agenda for today. We'll begin with a welcoming word from our Austin Fire Department Fire Chief, Joel G. Baker. And then we'll move into part 1 of the symposium, which is talking about risk. We'll have speakers Kelly Pale from Headwaters Economics. She'll discuss the road to living with wildfire. And then Nate Casepierre from our AFD Wildfire Division, as our GIS analyst, will talk about our local resources and strategies. We'll have a wildfire proclamation read by City of Austin Councilmember Allison Alter. And then we'll move into a panel discussion with Annie Schmidt, Carrie, Hines, Justice Jones, and Joyce Statz from the community. And that will make up part 2 of our symposium for the afternoon. So we'll talk about risk at the beginning in part 1, and then we'll move into part 2, which is talking about being empowered to work against unwanted wildfire activity. And as soon as our minute's up, we'll be able to look at, here's the results from our poll. So it looks like we have a lot of community members from the Austin area, some city government, some fire department folks have joined us for the afternoon. So very excited that we have so many community members that are joining us here today. And we hope that everyone will find a lot of good information that they can take away from this. Next, we'd like to welcome our Fire Chief, Joel G. Baker, to provide some opening remarks for our symposium. Chief Baker's been with the Austin Fire Department for almost 2.5 years and has become a solid champion for the work done by the Wildfire Division and our City of Austin partners who endeavor to reduce wildfire risk. So, Chief Baker, thank you for joining us.
Can you hear me okay? Good. Good afternoon and welcome to, I'm having some technical difficulty here, right. Good afternoon and welcome to the 8th Annual Wildfire Symposium. I am Fire Chief George G. Baker, And on behalf of the entire Austin Fire Department, and especially our Wildfire Division, I want to thank you for joining us virtually. Hopefully next year, we'll be able to once again gather in person, but rest assured, this year's event is still full of excellent information designed to get you and your family ready for when, not if, the next wildfire occurs. Did you know that aside from California, Austin is the #1 place in the country most at risk from wildfire? Scary, I know, but the good news is that we are also one of the most proactive in reducing that risk. We take the threat wildfire brings to the community we serve very seriously, and we want you to as well. None of us can do that alone, so we all need to work together and do our parts to prepare, protect, and prevent as much as we can. With more than 60% of Austin in wildfire risk area, we can't afford to wait. The time to act is now. Previous fire seasons like the one in 2011 ravaged the central Texas area that made preparing for wildfire in Austin part of the new normal. This year's Wildfire Community Preparedness Symposium brings together subject matter experts from the local, state, and national areas, levels who are best in their areas in this business. When you log off, you'll be able to immediately apply some of the things you learned from them today and begin preparing yourself and your family, as well as your neighborhood, before the next wildfire occurs. By joining us today, you're taking the first step in learning about your role in wildfire preparedness. Because in Austin, wildfire is everyone's fight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chief Baker. It has been really comforting to know that we are as proactive as we are collectively in our area, and that we do have the network to expand that activity. And it's something that is very well known in our area, and something that we all are able to take notice of the collective proactivity that we have. So with that, we're going to move into part 1 of our symposium to discuss and understand overall risk for wildfire events, and then move into a look at our local risk. So we'd like to welcome first Kelly Pale from Headwaters Economics. As you can see, Kelly's experience boasts positions such as fire ecologist, land protection specialist, program director, and researcher, which provide a unique perspective on the integration of land management and risk mitigation that is pertinent to our current conversation. So Kelly, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Chief Stewart. I'm really delighted to be here with you today, and I had the great pleasure of joining the last symposium in person 2 years ago, and I'm really honored to be with you again here today. So yeah, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the road to living with wildfire, and I will start by just telling you a little bit about the organization where I work, Headwaters Economics. It's an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit research group, and we work on some of the toughest issues that communities face around land use and economic change, things like managing outdoor recreation and managing energy transitions, and climate-related disasters like flooding and wildfire. So we've been working on wildfire for over a decade, and we've now worked with more than 70 communities across the United States through our program called Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire. And we've been really lucky to work with Austin for over 5 years now, and learned a lot from our partnership with Austin. So one of the things that we've really come to embrace through our wildfire work is a statement from one of our friends and colleagues, Dr. Jack Cohen. He says, wildfires are inevitable. And, you know, we live in these fire-adapted ecosystems. These landscapes evolved with wildfire. So we shouldn't try to put all wildfires out. They're ecologically necessary in many places. So while wildfires are inevitable, wildfire disasters don't have to be. Wildfires only become disasters when they impact communities in negative ways. And the good news is that we have a lot of science and data and tools to become fire adapted and to better live alongside wildfire. There is a lot of risk inherent in the work in our lives. You know, unless you're a Formula One driver, you probably wouldn't drive on this slick, curvy road at 200 miles an hour. You would probably slow down, you would wear your seatbelt, Hopefully you took some training and you have a driver's license. And with wildfire, it's the same. There are strategies we can deploy to reduce our risk, to live with some inherent risk, but to mitigate those risks to keep us all safer. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the lenses we have to understand and measure risk, and some of the trends we're seeing nationally around growing wildfire risk. And then sort of tee up the conversation that I think we'll have the rest of the day about reducing wildfire risk. So I'm going to break wildfire risk down into 4 kind of distinct components. I think it's helpful for understanding the components of wildfire risk so that you can better understand how you can mitigate wildfire risk. So the first component is likelihood. This is the probability that a wildfire will occur. And it's largely driven by physical characteristics like the topography, the fuels, the weather, ignition sources. This is sort of like the probability that you'll get in a car at some point in your life, right? The likelihood that you could go your whole life without stepping foot in another car is pretty low. The likelihood that you won't experience a wildfire living in a fire-prone landscape is also low. The second component is intensity. For wildfire, we measure this by the energy or the heat that a fire emits, so it's measured by flame length. This is sort of like the speed of a car going down the road. And the third component is exposure. This is really getting at the spatial proximity of things you value, your home, your business, your neighborhood, to wildfire-prone conditions. So this is sort of like whether you might encounter dangerous road conditions like curves or ice or gravel on the road. These 3 factors, as they increase, your wildfire risk increases. But there's a 4th really important factor, and that is susceptibility. Susceptibility really gets at the question of whether you have the resources to prepare for, respond to, and recover from a wildfire if it were to occur. This is sort of like whether or not you buckle your seatbelt when you get in the car, or whether your car even came equipped with seatbelts. The factors on the left side of this diagram, we have less influence over. They're controlled by external characteristics for the most part, and we have more influence as we move to the right. And what I'm going to show you next is that in many cases, all of these factors of wildfire risk are increasing across the country. Today, wildfires burn longer and are more severe. The likelihood of fires is increasing, as is the intensity. In the Western United States, wildfire season is 3 months longer than it was in the 1980s, more than 80 days longer than it used to be. And wildfires are burning 700 times more acreage in severe fires than they were in the 1980s. This is brand new research. These factors are driven in part by the fact that we've really successfully suppressed all fires for the last century, and so there's a fuel buildup in many landscapes. But it's also driven in part by climate change and a warming, drying climate with longer growing seasons and less snowpack in the mountains. And as I'm sure you know, we are facing a pretty severe drought season this year, as we have for many years across much of the Western United States. And I understand that conditions in Austin this year are shaping up to be not too dissimilar from 2011 when the Bastrop fires were. So likelihood and intensity are increasing, but so is exposure. We're seeing more and more communities impacted by wildfire. And this is partly because we're building more and more communities in fire-prone landscapes. In fact, the wildland-urban interface, which is that area where flammable vegetation meets or intermingles with communities, it's the fastest growing land use type in the country. More than 1/3 of American homes are in the wildland-urban interface today. Some recent research we did found that 2,000 communities in the last few decades have experienced a wildfire at least 100 acres within 2 miles of town. That 2 miles is important because that's within the zone that embers could impact those communities. And you can see this is widespread from coast to coast. Since 2005, more than 89,000 structures have been lost to wildfire. In Texas, you've lost 5,000 structures in 300 different wildfire events, and Bastrop remains the 6th most destructive wildfire during that time period. 89,000 structures lost is like the entire city of Amarillo going up in smoke. We've participated in this recent mapping effort with the U.S. Forest Service called Wildfire Risk to Communities. You can find it at wildfirerisk.org. There's lots of interesting resources and tools there. And as you can see from this map, we've discovered, not surprisingly, that wildfire risk to homes is also widespread across the country. This is the first time that we've been able to map at a consistent scale using consistent data and methodology wildfire risk at the community level for the entire United States. So this allows us to compare across states, across counties, to really identify where we need to prioritize our resources as a nation. And as you just heard from Chief Baker, outside of California, Texas ranks the highest for number of communities with high wildfire risk. There's 728 communities in Texas with high wildfire risk. And other studies have found that Austin ranks right up there out of large cities with wildfire risk in the Western United States. And you'll see in a little bit with some great examples from Nate, who's going to show you the fantastic wildfire hub in Austin, that wildfire risk is widespread. And we know this from locally calibrated data that has been developed for you there in Austin. And this map is just showing you sort of the ranking. So the darker red on this map, the higher the wildfire risk. And you can see from east to west, north to south, wildfire risk rims the city. So even though likelihood, intensity, and exposure are increasing, we also are really coming to understand that susceptibility is not evenly distributed. Not all people are impacted equally in wildfire disasters. In fact, study after study has been showing that race and income are strongly correlated not only with whether or not you will be exposed to climate-related disasters, but to whether or not you have access to aid to recover from those disasters. So socioeconomic conditions can make people more vulnerable to wildfire because people may not have the resources to prepare for, respond to, and recover. A few years ago, Austin asked for our help building a tool to overlay where socioeconomic conditions that can make people more vulnerable to wildfire intersects with wildfire risk. And so I want to show you just a couple of examples from that tool. It's online and you can play with it. It's at the Wildfire Hub that Nate will show you in a little bit. So this map is showing you census tracts where people have self-identified, more than average number of, for Austin, people have self-identified as Black, American Indian, Asian, or Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So these tracts shown in orange and red are places where there are more people of those race and ethnic identities that are living in areas of wildfire risk. This is important because we know that centuries of systemic racism can make it difficult to trust institutions that are offering aid, and institutional and cultural barriers can make it more difficult to access and aid for mitigation or recovery after an event. These are census tracts with more people who are living in poverty and exposed to wildfire risk. Families who are living in poverty may lack the resources to prepare for wildfire. They may not have time or income to mitigate their homes, and people living in poverty are more likely to be renters, so they may not have the autonomy to harden their homes against wildfire. Those in poverty are also more likely to experience health impacts from environmental stressors. And these tracts show where there are more people living with disabilities in areas of high wildfire risk. Those with disabilities may have limited mobility, and they're more likely to have health conditions that can be exacerbated by wildfire smoke or by environmental stress. So the susceptibility in Austin is not even, just like the rest of the United States. Some people are made more susceptible to wildfire because of socioeconomic and demographic conditions. So all of these components of wildfire risk across the country, and certainly in Austin and Texas, are increasing. And no matter how you look at it, wildfire risk is growing. So now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about what we can do to reduce risk. I wish I had a silver bullet. I wish I could say there's one single thing we can do that will help us all reduce our wildfire risk. But of course, you all know, and as I'm sure we'll talk about today, it's much more complicated. Wildfires interplays with so many other factors. So it really takes a suite of tools and partnerships to make a dent in our wildfire risk. And the National Cohesive Strategy gives us a nice framework for thinking about this. The National Cohesive Strategy sort of has 3 pillars. Resilient landscapes, so thinking about fuel treatments and how we can manage the fuels on our landscapes. Safe, effective wildfire response, making sure that our fire service has the resources they need to safely help us prepare and respond to wildfires, and building fire-adapted communities. And that's where I want to focus my attention today. But in order to really understand how to build fire-adapted communities, we have to have a pretty good understanding of how homes burn down. And the good news is we actually have come a long way in the science in the last few years about how, in order to understand how homes burn down. So this is an experiment that the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety conducted just a few years ago. The home on the left was constructed using kind of traditional materials. It's got bark mulch. There were shrubs planted right up against the siding. The siding is made of cedar shingles. The windows are single pane glass, and the attic vents were relatively open. Whereas the home on the right has fiber cement siding, it has rock mulch, it has dual pane tempered glass windows, and attic vents designed for wildfire. And the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has these huge wind generators that they fill with embers, and they just blow these embers at this model home, thousands and thousands of embers. No direct flame contact, just embers. And you can see, after just a few minutes here, the home on the left is basically fully engulfed in flames, whereas the home on the right is almost unscathed. So the good news with this is that the home on the right doesn't cost more to build than the home on the left, and it uses technology materials that we already have available today. So because of research like that experiment, and a bunch of post-fire analyses that have been conducted across the country, we have a really strong understanding that embers are the primary culprit behind home loss in the United States. In a wildfire, millions of these will be blowing around, and they can travel a mile or more ahead of a wildfire. When they do, they will find and exploit any vulnerability they can. So that might be the wood mulch around the side of your home, or the shrubs and the landscaping planted too close to your siding. Could be flammable materials stored on your wooden deck, or gutter debris in your gutter or on your roof. If embers land there, they will ignite those materials. And once your home catches fire, it's almost impossible to put it out in a large wildfire event where the fire department may be spread thin. Fortunately, we can swap out a lot of these materials as homeowners, building new homes or retrofitting existing homes to harden our structures and our properties against wildfire. And although these are actions individual homeowners can take, there are also steps that communities can take to better plan how to live with wildfire. So things like building codes and landscape regulations can help require that homeowners and landlords build their homes to be hardened to wildfire and use wildfire-resistant landscaping. Steep slope ordinances and subdivision standards can help ensure that we're not building in some of those more high-risk areas, and that if we are, we're taking into consideration wildfire and things like evacuation routes and water supplies. And I hope that you know that Austin is a national leader in using these tools. In fact, the Wildland Urban Interface Code, just adopted by the city, I think is the first time a large city, you are the first large city outside the state of California to adopt such a code. So like many wildfire codes across the country, this one requires ignition-resistant construction materials, tempered glass windows, requires attic vents that consider wildfire, and defensible space, not just around the main residence, but around any accessory buildings as well. And we're seeing a lot of research. In fact, I just saw a brand new paper yesterday that is showing these WUI codes make a big difference. There's a measurable rate of success in communities that have adopted these kinds of codes in protecting homes and lives. So while Austin has done quite a lot to develop land use planning strategies and build partnerships, of course, there's more work to do. And truly, Austin is a national leader, from your WUI code to the prescribed firework and the shaded fuel breaks you're doing, to all the home inspections and FireWise communities that I'm excited to hear more about this afternoon. All of that work is fantastic. And there are also a lot of homes on the landscape today that need to be retrofitted. Of course, as you know, Austin is growing rapidly, and all of those new residences will be built somewhere with some wildfire risk. Those new residents might not understand wildfire risk and may need to be informed and educated about strategies for mitigation in our community. So the good news is that you're on the right path and truly setting the tone for much of the rest of the country. And we do have the science, data, and tools to continue along that road. So in closing, I just want to share a little bit of a parting thought. I have become obsessed with this Netflix show, Formula One Drive to Survive. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe this is old news for you because you have the Circuit of the Americas right there in Austin. But I didn't think I would love this show. I didn't, before I saw it, I didn't know anything about motorsport or racing. And I was surprised at how quickly I just fell in love with this show. Before I saw it, I had this naive perception that racing was all about the car and the driver. But I think the reason I've fallen in love with this show is because it's about so much more. It's a really complicated story about hundreds of people behind the scenes, all pulling together for success. There are engineers who spend a year or more designing this car, and then mechanics who spend all this time building it from scratch. And I'm excited to share with you that Nate Casepierre, who you'll hear from next, happens to be a race car mechanic. I didn't know that before, but I think that's a fantastic tie-in here. He's a man of many talents. And there are the pit crew who rehearse down to the millisecond every little detail so that they can make the car move as efficiently and smoothly as possible. The race car driver doesn't succeed unless the whole team is working together, and the driver can't succeed unless all of these people are pulling together. So I think there's a misperception among a lot of people that, similar to the misperception I had about race cars, that wildfire is really about the fire department. It's about the shiny red truck and the air tankers and the helicopters who swoop in at the last minute to save the day. But the reality is, fire departments can't do their job, and in fact are hampered in doing their job, if the rest of us aren't finely engineered and rehearsed and doing all of the work we need to do at the same time. So homeowners need to be working to harden their homes against wildfire. Developers should be thinking about how to build neighborhoods to be fire resistant and fire safe. Neighborhood groups working collectively to take action. Elected officials and land use planners thinking about codes and ordinances to protect vulnerable among us. Open space managers thinking about landscape planning, buffering communities, and working through fuel management. That all supports the fire department, which in turn supports everyone else. Truly, we're all in this together, and we don't any of us succeed unless we all succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was fantastic. Significant. About more than 1/3 of our homes are in the WUI, and I believe that translates into not equally, but 49% of Austin, I believe, is in the WUI as well. And I love that last picture about all of us working together. We all say wildfire is everyone's fight, but that diagram really does help us bring it all together. So thank you for that. All right, our next speaker will be Nate Casepierre. Kelly has mentioned him several times, and he's from our own AFD Wildfire Division. Nate is the muscle behind our Austin area wildfire hub, and he has a background in forestry. While he's one of our premier GIS analysts in the city, his previous experience with our fuels crew means that he understands the practical application of the work he's doing and how it is valuable for how his work is utilized throughout the wildfire division and the city. So Nate, welcome.
Thank you, Chief Stewart, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Kelly, for such a great presentation. I learned a lot, and I really appreciated the race car analogy. And so let me share my screen very quickly. And somebody tell me if you're able to see my screen.
We got you, Nate.
All right, thank you very much. So while Kelly talked about wildfire risk from a national perspective, I'd like to share some resources and strategies that we use here locally in Austin and Travis County to better understand wildfire risk. And so we use the same components that are nationally recognized as components of wildfire risk, and Kelly did a great job of summarizing these from probability, intensity, exposure, and susceptibility/sensitivity. And these are all very important components, and different risk maps that you'll see throughout the country use different inputs to better describe and define these categories. So I'm going to go through them one by one and talk about the local data sets that we've accumulated over the past decade to better understand and analyze wildfire risk locally here in Austin and Travis County. But I'd like to mention that wildfire risk can be thought of as the nexus between hazard and vulnerability. And so hazards are more difficult to change. They're inherent on the landscape, but our vulnerability doesn't have to be the case. We can be empowered to reduce our vulnerability by understanding it and identifying it with the techniques that I'll talk about today, and then reducing it strategically throughout the city of Austin. It can also be thought of as the nexus of likelihood and consequence. So likelihood deals with the probability categories that we'll discuss, but the intensity, exposure, and susceptibility are all consequences of that probability. And so we can understand risk by accumulating information that fits into one of these four components. And we use quantitative and qualitative data sets to better understand each of these components. So I'll talk a little bit about the data that we use to determine probability of wildfire risk. And Kelly did a great job of describing what probability is, the likelihood that any given area will burn throughout a year. And so we have very high resolution fuel types that we've collected with our partners in the Wildfire Coalition in the formation of our Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And we're very proud that our fuel model is specific to Austin and Travis County and captures the conditions that are very local here that we all love. We love our landscapes, and we have significant historical information on the probability that any single area within Austin and Travis County would burn. We also look at historical fire return intervals. This is what we've gathered from looking at long-term climatic trends in Austin and Travis County that tell us traditionally Austin and Travis County, any given area would burn every 5 to 7 years. And these would be very low intensity fires. But since we've suppressed fire on the landscape, these fuels tend to build up over time and don't burn as frequently. And that gives rise to the intensity, which I'll talk about later. But we also look at our ignition density. This is our local wildfire data that the Austin Fire Department collects. And in 2018, we did a study in conjunction with our partners down at Texas State University, looking at ignition frequency from 2012 to 2018. And what I mean by ignitions is things like roadside starts and brush fires and trash fires in vulnerable areas. Because wildfires, they never get called in as a wildfire. They usually start as something along a roadside or somebody burning brush or even structure fires that can get out of control. So this data can be hard to aggregate, but we looked at the data that we had available from 2012 to 2018. We looked at over 175 wildfire-related calls that the Austin Fire Department responded to. And a shout out to the Austin Fire Department. They do a great job of putting out ignitions here in the Austin area. So they really are on the money, and we use this data to strategically place our assets within the city of Austin to better protect homes in vulnerable communities. But you'll see on the map on the right, as this map cycles through the years, that ignitions are an annual issue that is pretty much a constant. And we see trends that tend to ebb and flow, but it's relatively constant in the past 6 years. And this further corroborates the data that was aggregated during the formation of our Community Wildfire Protection Plan in 2012. That, as Kelly mentioned, we live in a fire-adapted community, and we have to learn how to live with wildfire. And so part of the study that was conducted with Texas State in 2018 looked at a correlation between our burn model, our fuel models, and our ignition trends. And so you'll see on the years on the map on the left, there's a correlation between our fine fuels model, which I'll describe in more detail, and our ignition patterns that are predominantly on the east side of town, council districts 1 and 2 specifically. And then in 2018, they group in correlation with our fuel models in the north and the south. But let me go back to our Travis County fuel types. So these fuel types we created in conjunction with research partners, both academic and local expertise, to create a fuel model that more accurately reflects our local fuels. And when I say fuels, I mean vegetation types or land cover. And so you can see that the western part of our county is dominated by closed juniper woodland and a mixed juniper hardwood forest. And then on the east corridor of our town, we do have some dense ash juniper woodlands and mixed juniper hardwood forest, but it's mostly dominated by the sparse, dry climate grass. And then you can see on the western and southwestern portions of the county are also dominated by sparse, dry climate grass. And I'll speak more to them as I continue throughout the presentation. So let me talk about the fire behavior model outputs that are derivatives of the fuel model that we created back in 2012. And Kelly mentioned intensity. This is usually quantified by flame lengths. And so there are other fire behavior outputs, such as the rate of spread of a fire and its potential intensity, which I'll speak about. But the most important factor that lends itself to intensity, and perhaps the most important wildfire risk map that you'll see today, is our fire forecast danger map. And this is a Texas Forest Service map that they issue every day. And wildfire is largely a weather-driven event. And so your wildfire risk isn't going to be the same from day to day. It's going to evolve and change over time based on the weather patterns. And so the most important thing that you can do to be prepared for wildfire is to go and look at this map daily. And we're working on methodologies to make you better inform you of when things creep into high and very high and even extreme. But you can see that these little black dots on the map are weather stations. And we're very fortunate here in Austin and Travis County to have about 5 weather stations that help us analyze at a very granular level the fire danger rating from day to day. And I'm going to share with you later some resources on how to access this every day. And so getting back to the intensity factor of the fire, we too measure the intensity based off of potential flame lengths, based off of the possibility that could occur from a given fire. And I should mention that these flame lengths are not something that would occur under normal conditions. They would occur under conditions that are extremely rare, but as public safety servants, we have to prepare for them anyway. And so you can see we measure flame lengths based off of feet. This is the feet from the beginning of the flame all the way up to the top of the flame. And the highest category we have is 30 feet. So you can see that predominantly the west side of town is capable of producing the most intensity. But there are also large pockets of intensity throughout the east side of town and throughout Travis County as a whole. Another factor that goes into the potential intensity of a fire is its rate of spread. And so I mentioned that there are fine, flashy, grassy fuels on the east side of town. And this is what you can see represented in this data set. Fires that occur in grasslands tend to move a lot quicker than fires that occur in dense vegetated wooded areas, which dominate the west side of our town. And we measure these in chains. That's a forestry term, and every chain is 66 feet. And so you may see this, the highest category as about 150 chains, but that actually only amounts to about 1.8 miles per hour. So what we're measuring is not the ability for embers to creep, but we're measuring if it was a creeping fire on the surface of the fuels. So it's a surface fire spread in effect. But it's a very interesting data set to look at. And you see it over on the southwest side of town that rates of spread are increasingly high too. And this type of information helps us when we analyze areas for evacuation potential. We want to know what areas are at risk and what areas will the fire be moving quicker towards a neighborhood. And so I want to talk a little about factors that we consider subcomponents of exposure. These would be proximity to hazardous fuels, proximity of structures to each other, and the evacuation complexity. And so Kelly mentioned a wildfire risk analysis that mentioned that the city of Austin was ranked fifth among major cities for exposure to wildfire risk. And these are the types of data sets that they use to analyze that exposure. So while probability of a wildfire is relatively low for our county when compared to other areas of the country, we have significant exposure in the city of Austin, Travis County because of our wildland-urban interface factors, which I'll speak about, that compel us to prepare for the worst-case scenario. And you'll notice that in data sets throughout the country, they're geared towards large-scale wildfire events, right? In a lot of cities out west, they have very defined WUI boundaries. But in the city of Austin, we have a very disjunct wildland-urban interface boundary. And so this map here shows the wildland-urban interface in Travis County. And what you'll see is that the green area are the wildlands throughout Travis County. And these colored areas are structures that we consider to be in the wildland-urban interface. And you notice it's not a very distinct line. It's got a lot of jagged edges, and it makes a ring around the city of Austin. And so what this data is actually showing are structures that have been color-coded based on their proximity to wildland areas or the wildland-urban interface. And I'll mention that 65% of our structures in Austin, or I'm sorry, that's a typo, I meant in Travis County, are in the wildland-urban interface. So if I focus in on the city of Austin, 49% of structures in Austin are in the wildland-urban interface. And you can see that the wildland-urban interface impacts all council districts within Austin and Travis County. So this isn't just an issue that occurs in a single council district, but it impacts all of us together. And so I'm going to pick on a neighborhood up in Northwest Austin. This is called the Northwest Austin Civic Association neighborhood, or NOACA. It's in Council District 10. So the data I'm showing you is available on our online maps, and you'll have the ability to zoom in and out and see if your home is in the wildland-urban interface. So as I zoom in here, you can see that boundary that I'm talking about. This green line represents that hard edge between wildlands and neighborhoods. And the more hard edge you have, I think of it in terms of surface area. So the more hard edge you have, the more exposure there is, and the more probability there is for a wildfire igniting and moving from the neighborhoods into the wildlands. And I should mention that our data shows that our ignitions are largely a human-driven event here in Travis County. And so they don't start down in the bottom of these deep valleys. They always start on one of these edges and move from human-caused ignition sources into these wildlands. And so this green line that we've quantified and we update every 2 years shows 627 miles of this WUI boundary in Austin alone. That's very significant and lends to our high level of exposure here in Austin and Travis County. Another data set that lends to exposure is our structure proximity to each other data set. So as lessons that we've learned over the past 10 years, I would say, of fires that have occurred out west show that the chances of large-scale neighborhood level structure losses occur when structures are densely packed together near the wildland-urban interface. And we're able to update this data set across Austin and Travis County to show your proximity of your house to your neighbor's house. So if your neighbor's house catches fire, there's a larger chance of your house catching fire too. We call that conflagration. And this is one of the inputs that we use to model the dynamic between traditional wildland fuel models and WUI dynamic models that contribute to overall wildfire risk. Another qualitative measure that we incorporate into wildfire risk is the evacuation complexity. So there are a significant number of neighborhoods that weren't built with wildfire safety in mind. And we've done great work to analyze and collect this data set in Austin and Travis County. You can see that we've identified 53 neighborhoods that have limited access or ingress and egress. So that makes it difficult to evacuate if there's an evacuation order. We already know that traffic is a large issue here in Travis County and Austin. And a lot of our wildfires occur during those peak traffic periods of the day. And so this is something that we're tackling on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. We've also worked to identify potential community refuge locations. These would be shelters set up as evacuation locations for people to go to if they had to leave their homes. We've also analyzed, in conjunction with our partners at the University of Texas, evacuation pinch point intersections. These are intersections throughout the perimeter of Austin that could be significantly impacted if there was a wildfire evacuation in those areas. And we've also maintained a data set that shows our primary evacuation corridors and where wildfire specifically threatens those evacuation corridors. And so what we've done is we've aggregated all of these qualitative and quantitative data sets into a holistic wildfire risk map that I'm showing here, and I've highlighted the city of Austin, and you can see that there are areas outside of the city of Austin that are comprised of high risk, but within the city of Austin, only 14% is actually aggregated to an area that is defined overall as high risk. That's not to say there aren't pockets of high risk throughout Austin and Travis County, but we've created these community response areas to better define overall wildfire risk and simplify the map. So I'll mention that this is also an interactive map that we have online where you can go in and click on different political boundaries, and you can click on individual council district and you'll get information on its relative risk. For instance, here I've clicked on District 1 up in the top right. It's ranked 4th out of the 10 council districts that comprise the city of Austin. You can see exactly how much structures within that council district are in the wildland urban interface, see how much area within that council district are covered by wildlands, and see exactly the amount of wildland urban interface in miles that exist. And if you zoom in, you'll be able to see our high resolution model, which shows the exact areas of most concern within any given area. But it's important to remember that you can't only consider any given pixel as your overall wildfire risk score, because as Kelly mentioned, Structure losses from wildfire are largely an ember-driven event. So you can be up to 1.5 miles from a wildfire that's going on in some other neighborhood and have a potential structure loss in your neighborhood if your home isn't hardened. And so there's common misconceptions that we're talking about radiant heat in a lot of these maps. We're not only concerned about radiant heat and structure to structure spread, but we're very concerned about the impacts of ember intrusion. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, is the susceptibility and sensitivity issues that Kelly and I worked together in the past to better define for Austin and Travis County. These are factors like income and age, language and education, housing status, and social status. And we worked together a couple of years ago to come up with a vulnerable populations tool to look at the dynamics between wildfire risk and the populations that live there. And it's a great tool. You can aggregate by any demographic that you're interested in to learn more about the factors in that given area. And I'm looking forward to accessing the 2020 census data as it comes online and creating a more even granular view of this concept. So I look forward to working with you again, Kelly. And so where do you go to find all these great tools and data that we've accumulated over the past 10 years? You can go to our website, atxwildfire.com, where you'll find a link to our new Austin Area Wildfire Hub. This is a tool, a portal, to access all the critical information and initiatives that are going on in the Austin area. And we call it the Austin area, not just the Austin, because we have significant partners in the county and our general area that comprise our wildfire coalition. And I'll be working with our coalition to be able to integrate tools and information that they have to mitigate the risk of wildfire throughout Austin and Travis County. But the first thing that you'll see when you go to the homepage of the Austin Area Wildfire Hub are those fire danger rating maps that I mentioned that are so important. So you'll be able to check those every day and see what your fire danger rating is. Also, we have information about Travis County's burn bans and Austin's burn bans and maps to visualize this information. And you can sign up to get text messages about burn bans. We also have a situational awareness map that is front and center on the homepage. This can show active ongoing wildfire incidents should they occur in Austin and Travis County. It's a very great resource. We link local, national, and state resources such as Texas Forest Service incident data. And so if there's an ongoing event, you can get real-time information on it through our website. I should also mention that we've linked the map to very interesting satellite feeds, MODIS and VIIRS satellites. And what they are thermal satellites that pass over every 24 to 48 hours, and they are very good at recognizing hotspots. And so we have a very robust prescribed burning platform throughout Austin and Travis County. And when I see a hotspot pop up on the map, I check to see if it was prescribed burn. But we're now implementing protocols to have our prescribed burns represented on this map, so that if you see smoke in the air and you're concerned, you can check the map to see if there was a prescribed burn scheduled for that. And if not, you can call the police. And if you're unsure, call the police anyway. We also have an active incident page that Austin maintains. This shows the ongoing incidents that Austin Fire Department is responding to. Not only wildfire events, but all ongoing incidents. And the reason we link to all ongoing incidents is, like I mentioned, wildfires very rarely start as a call that was, I see a wildfire. It's always something else, like a roadside start or a brush fire. And so if you do see an incident going on, or you're concerned about something that you hear, you can check the Wildfire Hub for more information about it. And as Kelly mentioned, wildfire is everyone's fight, and we have tremendous partners throughout Austin and Travis County to help us in our fight against wildfire. organizations such as Austin Water Utility and Parks and Rec. And on this hub, you can go and see initiatives that they're working on that help us maintain resilient landscapes here in Austin and Chaves County. We also have an events calendar. So if you want to know about upcoming wildfire events that the Austin Fire Department is involved in, or if you want to schedule one in your community, we've empowered you to be able to request an event through our hub. Or if you've already scheduled an event, you can request to have your event added to our calendar. And in this way, we can inform the public of all the wildfire-related initiatives that are going on throughout Austin and Chaves County. Another very important tool that I'd like you all to visit is the link up at the top, What's My Wildfire Risk? So if you click on that, it's going to take you straight to the data, and you'll be able to enter your address, and it'll take you straight to your home and show you what your wildfire risk is, and provide you with information to learn more about the specific inputs that contribute to your wildfire risk overall. And there will be a test on this after the show, so I'm just teasing about that. But check it out and let me know if it works for your address. Also, we go into the specific initiatives that we have to mitigate wildfire risk in Austin and Travis County. These are resilient landscapes, fire-wise communities, and resilient response. But I'll show you our resilient landscapes information first. So we have tremendous mitigation tools throughout Austin and Travis County that Justice is going to speak on later. But these are comprised of both prescribed fire activities that work to reduce the intensity of fire on the landscapes and restore native landscapes, but also shaded fuel breaks that go in and reduce the potential intensity of a fire by actively cutting fuels where they've grown dense along city-owned boundaries, where these boundaries abut neighborhoods. And so these are where fuels tend to build up. We call it the edge effect, where native and invasive species have intermingled and have grown too dense because of they haven't been treated by wildfire like they would in the past. And so we go in with these mechanical projects and treat the fuel just to overall reduce the overall intensity of a wildfire occurring in those areas. But I should mention that prescribed fire is perhaps the best tool and the most natural tool that we can to reduce the potential intensity of fire on the landscape. And a shout out to all of our prescribed burn partners throughout Austin and Travis County. We have significant programs to restore native landscapes through prescribed burning throughout Austin and Travis County. And these are great programs and perhaps the single best tool that we can use on the landscape to reduce wildfire risk. It's counterintuitive, but as we say, small fires prevent large fires. And as I mentioned, we used to have low intensity fires that would come through our area every 5 to 7 years in Austin and Travis County. And what we try to do is release that energy in a controlled manner using our prescribed fires. And so if you're interested in seeing what projects we've got going on at any given time and where in Austin and Travis County these are taking place, you can see project maps in our Resilient Landscapes tab. I should mention that right now we're only linking to data sets from the city of Austin. These are data sets that not only we maintain as the Austin Fire Department, but Austin Parks and Recreation Department, Austin Water Utility, Austin Energy, all of our partners work together with us to help manage the lands that they're responsible for in a strategic and safe way for the long term. And you can see that information in great detail on our website now. You can get live statistics on our progress for reducing the potential intensity of these boundaries that I spoke about and where exactly the work is taking place. And you can also see our upcoming projects on this page. And I'll mention briefly our Firewise Community Program. You're going to hear more about this throughout the day, but we've worked with local and national programs such as the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network and the NFPA Firewise program to help empower neighborhoods to take responsibility for the wildfire factors that they can control and work to reduce their wildfire risk. And we're very proud of the work that we've done with specific communities. We're the nation's leader in number of fire-wise communities, with 20 here in Austin alone. And there are 53 neighborhoods here in Austin that we have regular communication with, that we're working towards becoming fire-wise communities. So check out the map, and if you don't see your neighborhood on there, reach out to us later, and we can empower you with the information that you need to make your community wildfire safe. There are other community resources too that give you more information about these programs. And so there's also an About Us tab where you can learn more about the cohesive strategy, the National Cohesive Wildfire Management Strategy, that are the tools that we use as a fire department to mitigate the threat of wildfire. And we also have our access to our Wildfire Newsletter, which is issued on a monthly basis, where you can learn about wildfire events and news here in Austin and Travis County. And that's published out of our Wildfire Division Department. And it's a great resource. And so it's an email that you can sign up for through our website. And if you're already signed up, you can testify how great it is. But if you're not signed up, I would encourage you to go to the Wildfire Hub and sign up. And then, as I mentioned, we have a robust portfolio of maps and dashboards where you can see where the Austin Fire Department is working in real time from week to week to have meetings and planning events and fuels mitigation projects and even response projects that you can see in real time on our dashboards. You can also see where our AFD Wildfire Division fuels crew is working on the landscape to mitigate the threat of wildfire on City of Austin owned properties. And so there's a vast amount of resources in this hub, and there'll be even more as we build it out. But I should mention that there's a search function where if you don't see what you're looking for right away, you can search for it, and it'll take you to a catalog of scheduled events, data, documents, maps, and applications that are hidden behind the scenes. There's just too much in here to be shown on a single screen. And so it's a great resource. All the data that I talked about today are available within the hub, and we'll be empowering more functionality into the tool for you to be able to make your own customized maps, for you to self-report on information that is pertinent to your community as we developed local level community wildfire protection plans. So I mentioned the overarching community wildfire protection plan that the City of Austin and Travis County have adopted, where we're working to make this information more local and to empower communities on a community level basis to have the information they need and the tools they need to reduce the wildfire risk strategically. And so with that, I would turn it back over to the host, and thank you all for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate. I don't know if anybody kept track of how many times Nate said empower in that presentation, but it goes back to the title of our symposium today, that we really do want the community to feel empowered to take this information back to their communities and share it and educate across the city. And the comparison between the different areas of town, the fuel types, and how that would affect fire behavior in those areas. And it also leads into some of the questions that we've seen in the Q&A section of, hey, how can I get a copy of this PowerPoint so that I can take it back to my community? So that's exactly what we mean by empowering folks to take this information back out into the community and share it so that we can spread the word about what we can do to mitigate risk. So thank you very much, Nate. So yeah, please keep putting questions in the Q&A. Behind the scenes, Tanya Sones is our program manager for the Wildfire Division. She is answering those questions as they come up, so please continue to ask those questions. All right, now we are going to move into our next poll. So this is poll number 2 about wildfire risk. The results of this one are going to be shared after we have a short break. So we've got about a few minutes for this poll. And after this one, we're going to take a 10-minute wellness break. We'll go over the results from this poll then, and then we'll hear our proclamation regarding National Wildfire Day at that point. So please take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks. All right, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. So we're going to look at the results of the second poll that we did. Hopefully some folks were able to get on during the break and visit the hub and enter their address into the wildfire risk area. So we had 44% that said they do know their home's wildfire risk. And 18% of those were in the high level. So 20% were moderate that were able to get in there and figure it out. And 6% were low or elevated. So please continue to visit the hub, and very easy to find your wildfire risk by plugging in your address into that tool on the hub. All right, we would like to thank all of our community leaders who have joined us here today from the City of Austin and from Travis County. We're very grateful that you're here to help share this information, pass it on to your constituents and your communities, and help us spread the messaging that's all of the educational pieces that are very valuable from the symposium today. One of those community leaders is Councilmember Allison Alter from District 10, who will be reading a proclamation for National Wildfire Day while she's with us. Councilmember Alter has been a leader in supporting wildfire initiatives and works to spread those messages across the city. So Councilmember Alter, thank you for being with us and for reading your proclamation today.
Thank you so much, Chief Stewart. Good afternoon. My name is Allison Alter, and I have the honor of representing District 10 on the Austin City Council. I want to thank the Austin Fire Department and the Austin Travis County Wildfire Coalition for inviting me to join you this afternoon. It is my privilege to read a proclamation commemorating Community Wildfire Preparedness Day, which is this Saturday. I also want to thank everyone here for spending your afternoon learning more about our community's wildfire risk and what we can do to make our city safer. Everyone here knows, and experts agree, that it is not a matter of if, but when Austin will experience its next major wildfire event. Since entering office, I've worked closely with local and regional officials, community members, and my colleagues to raise awareness of wildfire mitigation and preparedness, and to ensure that the city responds to the magnitude of the risks with appropriate resources. We know the threat is real, and I invite you to be part of the solution as there is yet much work to be done. Wildfire is a community effort. Preparing for and mitigating the threat cannot solely fall to local government. Every one of us can and should take actions to minimize our personal risks and to make our city safer. Before I read the declaration, I also want to thank the members of the FireWise Alliance, especially their tireless leaders from my district, Joyce Statz and Linda Bailey. Your dedication to helping us prepare is very much appreciated. I also want to acknowledge the presence of two of my colleagues, District 6 Councilmember Mackenzie Kelly and District 8 Councilmember Paige Ellis, who I know join me in this proclamation and are watching as participants. Really is important that the three of us are here, and I'm sure many other folks representing council offices are on the line as well, because this awareness and this knowledge is so important for us to be prepared. So National Wildfire Community Preparedness Day is May 1st, and it serves as a day for community members everywhere to learn more about what they can do to protect their homes and neighborhoods. So I would now offer this proclamation. Be it known that, whereas Austin is one of the top 5 metropolitan areas in the country at risk for wildfire, and it is a matter of when, not if, the city will experience its next major wildfire event. And whereas the prevention and mitigation of wildfire threats must be a community effort, and there are actions that each resident can take to make themselves, their neighbors, and the city safer. And whereas the first Saturday in May marks National Wildfire Community Preparedness Day, a national campaign that encourages people and organizations everywhere to come together on a single day to take action to raise awareness and reduce wildfire risks. And whereas the city seeks to raise awareness of the wildfire threat and to invite Austinites to take steps to reduce our collective wildfire risks. Now, therefore, I, City Council Member Allison Alter, on behalf of Mayor Steve Adler, do hereby proclaim May 1st, 2021 as Austin Wildfire Community Preparedness Day. I hope you will join me in pushing the message and helping folks to acknowledge the need to take action on wildfire on Saturday and well beyond that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Councilmember Alter. We really appreciate you reading that for us. And it does take us back to that slide from Kelly Pale's presentation about it takes everyone to be participating in helping mitigate the risk in our area. So thank you from the community leaders for that addition to our symposium. All right, we're going to move into poll number 3 about mitigation event planning. So we'll have that poll up. We've got a minute for that one. And I'm going to go into talking about our next portion of the symposium while everyone's taking that poll. So our next part will be a panel discussion with some subject matter experts. We'll have Annie Schmidt from the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. Carrie Hines is with us from the Texas A&M Forest Service. And Justice Jones from our own Wildfire Division in the Austin Fire Department. And Joyce Statz from the Austin Area Firewise Alliance. Our moderator for our panel discussion will be James Duff. He is one of our Fire Adapted Communities program coordinators, along with Chris Vetramil, who's working in the background to ensure that what is being said corresponds to what you're seeing virtually. And our Fire Adapted Communities team works diligently throughout the year to provide information and education to our surrounding communities. And James is going to be introducing and facilitating the questions between the guest speakers that we have today. And James, I think we're ready for you to take it away. We've got the results of our poll, and welcome, James.
Thanks, Chief Stewart. Just give you all a second to look over the poll. It looks like the majority of people haven't planned an event, and of those that answered, quite a few are thinking about it. So first we have Annie Schmidt. Annie, if you would like to turn on your camera and unmute yourself, would love for you to speak a little bit about yourself. Tell our community members why it is that you are an expert in your field.
Well, thank you so much, James, for having me, and thank you to the community of Austin for hosting such a fabulous forum. My name is Annie Schmidt, and I have been working in and around communities preparing for wildfire for the last 20 years. My experience spans the local, state, and national levels. I'm currently a staff member for the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and I have the great honor and privilege of working with communities from Hawaii to New Jersey who are seeking to change their future with wildfire. My background, much of which is from the Pacific Northwest, has always involved fire, whether I was working for the Forest Service, the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, or my local fire district. It's incredibly important for communities to become empowered and for us to support that journey towards empowerment. And so I'm really excited to be with you all here today.
Thank you, Annie. And next we have someone whom I work fairly close with, Carrie Hines of the Texas Forest Service. Carrie, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, James. Do you guys have me?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. So I know I'm probably one of the more local faces. I'm really excited to be here again this year. The things that are happening in Austin are, I mean, you've heard it already from multiple presenters, are groundbreaking and setting the pace for what the rest of Texas should be thinking about doing. I've been with the Texas A&M Forest Service since 2012. My first 2 years were as an inventory forester, so I like to joke that I was literally hugging trees for my first 2 years with the Forest Service. I then switched over to the Mitigation and Prevention Department, which is all things to do with community preparedness when it comes to wildfire. In particular, the last few years, I've been really focused in on how preparing for wildfire and having environmental health to do with construction damage or water damage or just general ecosystem health, how they all fit together very nicely, especially with our fire-dependent ecosystems here in Texas. A lot of the people that we talk to fire is not on the top of their minds. So we have to give other reasons as to why the work we're suggesting is beneficial. I'm a certified arborist with ISA. I teach a class for arborists on wildfire preparedness, and I'm also a wildland firefighter and a public information officer, which are credentials through NWCG, National Wildfire Coordination Group. Happy to be here. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Carrie. And up next, we have my boss, and for someone who is aware of the wildfire community, a man who really doesn't need any introduction, but just for the sake of doing it anyway, Justice Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm mostly honored and privileged to be such a part of such an esteemed and knowledgeable panel. Really looking forward to the panel discussion. Very briefly, I've spent my entire career in wildland urban interface, minus my time in the military. Prior to joining the Austin Fire Department, I led the Texas A&M Forest Service Mitigation and Prevention Division, which you heard from Carrie, the state's efforts to assist local communities in becoming fire adapted. I was a founding member of the Austin Fire Department Wildfire Division, and I work closely with members within the division and partners across the city and county to implement our community wildfire protection plan. And I'm excited to be a part of today's panel and spend this time with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice. Up next, we have Joyce Statz, one of our most esteemed community organizers. Joyce, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and the Austin Area Firewise Alliance?
Sure. I'm Joyce Statz, and I'm the learner in this group. As you can tell, everybody else in the program has had many years of experience doing things with wildfire and mitigation and prevention. And I'm one of the community members who has been learning about this, especially over the last 10 years. When we bought our house in 1984, we had no idea that we were living in a tinderbox. We're on the WUI in Northwest Hills. And so about 10 years ago, some of my, some of my neighbors gathered together at our house and talked with a member of the fire department about just what was below us in that valley. And that inspired us to put together a wildfire prevention committee for our neighborhood, which inspired us to bring in the fire department to talk to our neighborhood association. You saw when Nate was looking at his maps that he honed in on Nawaka at one point. Well, that's our neighborhood, which is chock full of green space surrounded by homes. And so learning how to harden our homes, learning what it means to be firewise has been very important for our neighborhood. And over the last several years, we've gathered together a coalition of neighborhood leaders across the city, thanks to first being inspired to do that by the Wildfire Division. And so we have now more than 35 neighborhoods whose leaders are meeting on a quarterly basis to share information about how to make their homes hardened against wildfire and how to help their neighbors contribute to the efforts. So I look forward to talking with you about that as James gives us his set of questions. So back to you, James.
Thank you, Joyce. So what we're going to have going on right now is hopefully a somewhat informal discussion based on questions that we will present to both you, the panelists, and the audience members on the screen. It is something that I'm going to leave up to the panelists on who feels most well equipped to answer that question immediately. And then hopefully there might be some conversation that happens after the fact. I will probably jump in at some point to move us along to the next question. But it's mostly going to be up to y'all. Is there any questions that y'all have for me before we begin? Sounds good. So the first question, what is a fire adapted community and what is the difference between that and a firewise community?
So that's a great question, James, and I'll jump in here if I may. A fire adapted community is a community that understands its risk. It is a community that is taking action before, during, and after a fire in order for that community to be more resilient. Fire-adapted community members are informed and prepared, and they're collaboratively planning and taking action to better live with wildland fire. So really, to boil all of that down, at its core, fire-adapted communities is a framework. It's a concept to help us all live better with wildfire. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a checklist or a specific set of actions that any community must take. It's just really a holistic and adaptive framework. And in line with the analogy about racing, you can consider fire-adapted community as a bit of a toolbox. And communities can adapt and customize that toolbox to fit their specific needs. So the FireWise USA recognition program is one of the many tools that a community can use to address that risk. So if the concept of fire adaptation is the toolbox, fire adapted community is a real, or FireWise communities is a really important hammer or screwdriver or wrench. It's focused primarily on residents and residential action, and it's really an important piece of the adaptation puzzle. So IAFC, the International Association of Fire Chiefs Ready, Set, Go program would be another tool in that toolbox, as are building codes or community wildfire protection plans.
I think for most of us, the FireWise community label is better known. And fire adapted communities is something that we're starting to talk about more with neighbors and with community leaders. So you can use both of them to get people's attention.
Thank you.
What fire adapted communities means is that we're aligning with the needs of our communities at risk and how FireWise plays the foundation of our fire adapted communities efforts, because in reality, everything we're doing is to protect those that we serve. And so fire adapted communities is our framework for assisting our FireWise communities at the grass level here in Austin and Travis County.
I think the people that play a role in each of these programs is also fairly substantially different. So just like Annie was mentioning that FireWise is a tool in the FAC toolbox, I see FireWise USA as that grassroots effort where neighbors are talking to neighbors at a community level. Certainly fire departments across the state occasionally, and especially in Austin, play a role, but FAC is much more holistic when it comes to who has a role. It's everyone, in case there was questions, and how all of those people fit into fire adapted community concept versus just neighbors working with neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, y'all. And I'm sure most everyone picked up on it. And Carrie did a fantastic job of providing context clues, but if you missed it, FAC, we love acronyms. So FAC is Fire Adapted Communities. And next, we have the question, can you define what a community wildfire protection plan is, what it's used for, and what goes into it?
Should I go first on this one?
Take a stab at defining that at the municipal level and allow others to add at various levels. For us, what a community wildfire protection plan represents is collaboration and reflected in a planning document. And it should and did in our case include numerous stakeholders from across Austin and the city of Austin and Travis County, who provided input based on the values that they are most concerned with being impacted by wildfire, and strategies to mitigate that wildfire risk. But the key to any effective community planning effort is that collaboration and inclusivity of various perspectives and voices to ensure that it's reflective of what the community's needs are to mitigate wildfire risk.
Mm-hmm.
Carrie, I think you had something to say on that as well.
Yeah, so I guess just recognizing the difference, there's all sorts of levels of community mitigation planning, and they can all be formal documents. A CWPP is actually something that was legislatively is mandated, is Annie, is that the right word? But legislatively created out of the 2003 Healthy Forest Restoration Act. So it's a document that there are specific things that have to be included. As Justice said, collaboration is one of them. Treatment, the fancy terms they use are treatment of structural ignitability. So you have to make a plan on how you're going to address how wildfire impacts homes, and you have to address restoring healthy landscapes. So a CWPP has to have those things versus like, you can have community mitigation plans, you can have pre-attack plans, you can do the incredible work that Austin Fire Department has been doing when it comes to recognizing pinch points and evacuation planning. And so it's also, it falls under the label of community mitigation planning.
Mm-hmm. And we make a derivative of those at the lowest level at the neighborhood plan too, when we're creating a community action plan for what a Firewise community expects to do, how it understands its risks, how it understands the groups it collaborates with, and what it has in its plans for mitigating the risk for the community. So that's a variant, I think, of what we see as a CWPP.
Thank you, Joyce. I think you're ready to move on unless anyone else has any final thoughts on this one.
Mm-hmm.
You guys covered it very well. Thank you. So next, we have my attempt at playing devil's advocate. I'm sure anyone who's here has probably heard some of these things mentioned. I hope that you don't believe them, but just so that you can have something to reply to other people who feel this way, to the panel. Aren't disasters like fire, floods, and other acts of God why we pay for insurance? Isn't addressing wildfire the responsibility of firefighters? And do I really need all these steps? Aren't I just covered?
So we hope that everyone here would at least have a basic answer to that. That may be why you're here, to hear these answers. I hear these arguments. There are people who are impacted by wildfire every year who do not think that it is their responsibility to prepare for them or any other disasters. And I would like to think that even outside of replacing the non-replaceable items, the family memories, the safety that we feel in our home, in our community, the sense of place, the environmental impacts of large wildfires versus like a more low intensity fire, the community safety, the potential for related accidents and deaths. And if none of those strike you as appealing, the safety of your firefighters and your first responders has to come into play. Wildland firefighters are not trained to, and we do not have the equipment to treat or to protect homes, large amounts of homes in wildfires. I was on a fire just a couple weekends ago in Bastrop County, and there were just about 12 homes directly threatened by a 37-acre wildfire. And we were able to have an engine of some sort, a fire engine, on pretty much every single home that was directly threatened. And the reason we were able to do that was because the homes, whether they knew it or not, had done the work that we're talking about. The landscapes were resilient and defensible. And that was only a 37-acre fire. If it had gotten larger than that, or if the homes had not been defensible, our firefighters would have been going out of their way to try to protect those homes. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in. Mm-hmm. With the law enforcement officers who are going door to door, knocking, telling people to evacuate, those people don't have any PPE, personal protective equipment against wildfires. So the sense of place, the environmental damage, the loss sustained that's more than just things, and then our first responders, I would hope all of those things hopefully combined as a decent rebuttal to those devil advocate questions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Carrie.
Well, and I would just challenge the myth that insurance is going to cover your losses. What we've seen time and time again in these larger wildfires throughout the nation is that most folks or many folks who experience wildfire related loss are either not insured or underinsured, right? So there's even if you have insurance, it may not cover the magnitude of your financial losses. And so that has been a significant theme in a lot of these larger fires. And the other thing that I think probably may go without saying, but probably should be said anyway, is that the reality of these urban conflagrations that we're starting to see in communities challenge even our most prepared and well-equipped fire departments who are geared for structural protection. It is physically impossible to get an engine everywhere it needs to be in those scenarios. And so you're really in a situation where we as a community have to accept that we all have a responsibility to undertake the actions that we can to better prepare our homes, businesses, and places. And so it's not enough just to be insured. Your insurance might not be enough. It's not enough just to have a phenomenal fire department, and we should all be so lucky to have a phenomenal fire department. But that alone is not enough. We have to be working together with our residents, with our business owners, with our fire department, with our state forestry agencies, with our researchers, with our public health entities. The list goes on and on, but every one of those entities, and perhaps most importantly, those who live in our communities, have a role in this equation. And so, yeah, we do need to take all of those steps. You're not just covered.
Thank you, Annie.
I would like to add that the insurance issue goes beyond just recovering from losses. We're entering into an environment, and we see this very clearly out in Western states, where if you don't apply these best practices that we've talked about today,
you can't get insurance.
It's ignition resistant, and you have managed your landscape to reduce the likelihood of fire to spread to your property. Many properties are being identified as uninsurable without that type of mitigation, and in some cases with mitigation. So your first challenge is, do you want to keep your insurance and keep your mortgage? Because that's a horizon issue that we all need to consider. The second challenge is wildfires impact homes differently than structure fires. During structure fires, you always have resources on site, and very often multiple resources that are able to limit the spread of that fire, maybe even to a room in the home. During a wildland fire, we see almost complete destruction of homes that are ignited during that event. That means wildfire doesn't discriminate based on income or location. Part of my last job with the Texas A&M Forest Service, and Carrie is carrying this forward, is post-fire assessments of why homes were destroyed during these events. And it's not unlikely to encounter people in million-dollar homes who are on their hands and knees just trying to find some effect of theirs that they lost during that fire. So the impacts are much more broadly reaching than economic, and the solutions we're offering might be a solution to be able to keep that insurance in place if needed.
Thank you, Justice. Joyce, if you have anything else or anyone else wants to touch on it quickly, all right, we will.
I think that's well covered.
I agree. All right. Our next question is, how do you get residents engaged and raise awareness in communities?
You have a pretty good collection of ideas there in that infographic. But I think it's very situation specific. Getting a group of neighbors in one area interested isn't as easy as it is in another area, for example. But some things that we've noticed are things like the recent Bastrop fire gets people thinking about it again. So while we don't like to see this happen, one of the best ways to get residents engaged is for them to see the reality of a fire. And if it's close by, that has more impact than if it's a California wildfire. But things we've done that help get people involved include gathering them together in a home. And if we can have a firefighter come join us and talk with the whole set of residents about the wildfire risk of their area, that works pretty well. For our community, for NOACA, we have an annual talk by somebody from the Wildfire Division at our annual meeting. And when we can meet in person, we bring in the Wildfire Division simulation table, the sim table, being able to show people very graphically what it would mean to have a fire start in one of those green spaces that we identified in the maps Nate was showing is really impressive. Usually we show something that has an ember tossed on Loop 360 or something that comes from a home that lands in the green area and then spreads elsewhere with embers. But what we've noticed is after each one of those demonstrations, we get more people signing up for risk evaluations for their homes. So something graphic, something visual can really be helpful there. We found in my neighborhood that we have both a neighborhood watch group and a Firewise community of the same people. And so we can leverage things like National Night Out, not just for neighborhood watch, but also for wildfire information spreading and discussion about what things are being done by the neighbors. So that's another way to get some awareness. But I think we're going to find throughout that interest will wane over time, and anything we can do to get people re-engaged is going to be necessary. There are just too many things on our plates these days. So something that I've been enjoying recently is to take the newsletter that comes from the Wildfire Division and send it out, send the link out in our neighborhood newsletters. So they're not just listening to me, but they're listening to James and the things that he puts together in the newsletter. And I think that helps raise awareness. So those are some of the things we've been doing.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you for the plug for the newsletter. Appreciate that one. Anyone want to jump in?
I bet this is one of the things that statewide and nationwide we struggle with, right? There's only so many public service announcement style issues that residents can care about and take action on before we reach a breaking point. And just like Joyce mentioned, being able to use a recent fire to recapture interest certainly works. And then over a period of time, as she mentioned, it wanes. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy, and I have found some success with pairing wildfire mitigation with other environmental issues or even community safety issues. So whether it's we usually flood more than we see fires in Central Texas. So if you look at the amount of down woody debris and what that can mean when it floods and you're breaking out culverts and you're covering roads and you're building big dams, right? You know, in our communities. So those things connect. Or whether it's pollinator habitat, when you don't have a lot of bare mineral soil that can grow herbaceous material because it's covered up in, you know, a couple decades worth of juniper needles, you're not going to have a lot of pollinator habitat. So there's ways to combine these environmental messages, or even public we get a lot. So being able to feel safe in your public parks, to be able to see in your public parks, often combines with ladder fuel removal. So there's ways to join forces with some of the other public messages.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Carrie.
And I would add that it's important to join forces with other partners as well. Our communities are all different, and sometimes we're not the best messenger. Whatever our organization is not the best one to be doing a lot of the communicating with a specific portion of our community or others next door. And so really seeking out partners so that we have a diversity of voices coming to the table to start to work with our communities and meet their needs is incredibly important.
Yeah. Something that's been made available just recently is a link that we can put into our local website that has the Texas Forest Service fire danger rating. And having that fire danger map that Nate showed available to neighbors to click on any day, I think will be another thing that will help keep them aware and engaged.
To add to that, I think one of the key strategies that's been effective for us here in Austin and Travis County is to facilitate neighbor-to-neighbor discussion. And that's really what our Firewise Alliance is all about, is neighbors helping neighbors. And so it's a big credit to Joyce and her dedication to her community and other communities at risk to take new communities under their wing, to mentor them, to provide training on how to assess risks so they can go back in their communities. It creates a multiplier effect. I think it adds credibility when neighbors are talking to neighbors, and they can point to their own yards as an example of how to do this and be compatible in the environment that we live in. So there's lots of high elevation ways that you can reach people. Where I've seen a lot of impact is on that face-to-face and neighbor-to-neighbor approach that the Alliance takes. So helping each other not live in a stovepipe and co-evolve through their journey to being fire adapted.
Thank you, Justice. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to put a little spin on this question since we are doing this symposium virtually, and it has been a year of trying to figure out new and different ways to have these engagements. Has it been easier or harder? Not just learning these new tools, but having potentially increased accessibility to people?
I think it's been both, actually. I think what we've seen throughout the country is that there have been winners and losers with virtual engagement. And so in some places, in some communities, folks who were ordinarily too busy or had a conflict at a certain time are suddenly able to engage in community meetings over the computer in ways that they just hadn't been able to do so before. And in other communities, particularly our rural communities and places with less reliable internet access, lower bandwidth, we've definitely seen struggles just from a technological access perspective, getting folks connected. You know, obviously a lot of our systems have been built for in-person engagement, those site visits, those neighborhood meetings, those one-on-one connections with residents. And so reconfiguring that to even a hybrid or a more virtual approach has definitely brought some challenges. But you know, I would say that we have seen more engagement in some places. It has not necessarily all been a loss over the last year.
I'd have to say with our Alliance meetings, we have even better attendance virtually than we did in person. Although we missed the opportunity for the before and after gatherings with individuals to just chat about specific items or specific problems and do the networking. So it's a mixed bag.
Thank you. I'm going to move this along. And our next question is, how can communities change their future?
Fire future.
Well, communities are the only ones who can, right? This is not something that we can, as wildfire practitioners, can do for anyone. We have to do this work together. And so changing how fire impacts us, how it impacts our places and our homes and our businesses, it really requires all of us. And it requires all of us to be knowledgeable about our risks. And I think there's been some great discussion this morning about the tools that are available, technologically speaking, to help us become knowledgeable about our risks. But it also requires us to take action as well. And that's where some of Joyce's work, the work that's on the ground in Austin, really sort of helps cross the barrier from awareness of a risk to action on that risk. And so, you know, it's important for communities, because they're all different and at many different scales, to be taking the actions that make sense in their place. And so the tools that Austin uses are going to be different than the tools that someone in New Jersey uses, or the tools that someone in South Dakota uses, right? Or even the tools that a community uses a mile down the road. It's really important that communities are able to customize their approaches for their place and have knowledgeable practitioners like those on the panel, like Justice and Carrie and Joyce, to help move their work forward from that awareness of the risk to sort of actively changing the way they're going to live with wildfire.
I think a big one for us in Austin for our future is the impact of the WUI code that was adopted in January. It can't, in its current form, affect the buildings that are on the ground. But as we go into continual building in the WUI, using that code as a guide is going to help make those homes much more resilient. Without that, we have much more danger in our future. So I think that plus anything we can get done with fuel mitigation is going to help change our future.
Yeah, just to add to Joyce's great point, for the city of Austin, our job is to create an environment that lends itself to a cultural shift. And the way cities do that is through regulation or land use planning and leadership intent. The goal on our end is to create that environment that Austin grows into, that we create that culture shift. In the meantime, providing communities and residents with solutions they can implement at their level that are aligned with the city's strategies to become fire.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Justice. Anything else on this topic y'all want to talk about?
Nope.
All right. And how are state and local officials, along with implementers, working together to build fire resiliency?
I think one of the biggest ones, and this is one of the things that the FAC concept encourages, is just learning from each other, figuring out what's going on where, how we can assist, whether it be with manpower or information or planning, logistical needs. One of the first thing that comes to my mind is Travis County Parks Department. They do a phenomenal job with the prescribed firework that they do across the county. And whenever I show up on one of those fires, it's just such a mismatch of different patches from different agencies across the county. You know, there'll be a couple people from Austin Parks, and then there'll be somebody from maybe UT with the or the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And then I'm there, and maybe we have an engine and maybe some TPWD people. And so physically doing the work is a big one. And we oftentimes could not do the projects that we do without assistance from each other. But the first thing that popped into my head is learning from each other and supporting each other in developing our next steps.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Carrie.
As far
I think
as
that was.
as far as
Sorry,
local
Justice.
officials, sure. As far as the local officials supporting the building of fire resiliency, that takes place through forms of leadership intent, like the adoption of our Austin Travis County Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which gives us clear roles and responsibilities and strategies for enhancing our fire resiliency. And that can also take the form and things like council resolutions that direct city staff to ensure that wildfire is a priority. So very much at the local level, it's driven by things like our fire chief making wildfire the highest priority in Austin Fire Department because it's one of our highest risks. So that leadership intent is critical for local communities to be able to embrace the reduction in wildfire risk they hope to gain.
Mm-hmm.
Annie, since you've worked on such a broad cross-section of state, local, and even federal, is there any of comments from that broad range of experience you'd like to share?
I think it's really important that we just recognize that there's work occurring at multiple scales. There's work occurring at the local level, there's work occurring at the state level, and there is work occurring at the federal level. And one of the things that it's easy to do is just focus on the piece of the world that you're operating it in. But it's really critical that we start to build some connectivity, like like Justice and Carrie have really just talked about, in between the state and local scale, between the local and national scale, and really between those that are operating on all scales. And so, you know, this connection and joint learning, whether it be neighbor to neighbor learning at that level, or whether it be one community learning in Texas learning from another community in Texas, or whether it be a state reaching out to another state who's recently undergone some wildland fire strategic planning work, that sharing of knowledge and best practices really helps us build a more resilient system around wildfire, in addition to more resilient places. And it's really by crossing those scales that I see we start to see, and connecting them between scales, that I think we start to see some of the biggest impacts.
Thank you, Annie. I think we can move on to the next one. Anyone else want to make a last little comment? All right. So, can you, panel, provide us with a few examples of other communities across the country who are adapting to live better with wildfire? Can't use any of the examples on the page there. That's cheating.
So this is my job, right? To work with communities across the country who are adapting to better live with wildfire. One of the examples that I like comes from Ashland, Oregon. The whole community of Ashland has done some really robust work with smoke preparedness to better prepare their communities for both the impacts of both wildland fire smoke and also prescribed fire smoke. This has included some innovative partnerships with the Ashland Chamber of Commerce. It's included partnerships with their local health agency, their public health agency, and smokewiseashland.org, I think, is the website that really goes through a lot of these partnerships and preparedness actions. And this has really resulted in a community that is better able to not only withstand the wildfire impacts, but better able to accept the preparedness actions that are going to be necessary, in particular prescribed fire in their place, to better adapt to live with wildfire. And so that's a great example of a community, and their wildfire division is doing amazing work too, but their innovative work in an area that we don't necessarily always think about is what I'd like to highlight today. So that's one good example.
Thank you, Annie. Joyce, I know sometimes it's not the easiest to pat yourself on the back, but I would love for you to tell us, in the context of this question, a little bit about some of the communities within the Austin area Wildfire Alliance.
Well, we talked about an example that is a good one for how to get the group of homeowners to do something about removing wildfire fuel. I'd have to point to the Jester community and their 30-foot days that they've had several times in their history. They've put together sort of a promotion among the neighbors to clear their home areas, clear their landscapes of debris to 30 feet from the street, and then arranged with the Austin Resource Recovery folks to come out and pick up the debris. So set up a day when that happens, and then have the folks who take it all away appear and take it all away. One of the most interesting comments I heard from neighbors there after one of those cleanup days was, it was now easier to see the homes from the street because people had cleared some of the underbrush. And these were beautiful homes that weren't as appreciated before that cleanup effort. Something else that's been interesting is to have what's called an operational readiness exercise by the fire department within a community. And that really inspired my neighbors to pay attention and have some risk evaluations done on their homes, because they knew that on Saturday there was going to be a group of people here doing an exercise that would mirror what they would do if there was a wildfire. And so we were able to get a lot of people to pay attention that weekend. And we're looking forward to seeing more of those next year and following, as the Wildfire Division has all of the firefighters in Austin trained about wildland urban interface fires. Being able to have a class that comes out and practices in a neighborhood will get the neighborhood engaged, I think, in order to pay more attention. So in the end, we all get a little bit cleaner in our landscapes and a little bit more adapted to the fact that wildfire will one day come our way. I guess there's one other example that I could point out that I think has been really, really effective to get engagement. And that is when we have what we call a blitz of home wildfire risk evaluations. Go into a neighborhood with several teams of evaluators and throughout a whole day, just cover as many homes as you can, talking with the neighbors and explaining their risks. And in the end, again, they're going to have a little to-do list of things they will do to make them more adapted to deal with wildfire.
Thank you, Joyce. Carrie, do you mind if I pick on you since you have the entire state of Texas? I know we've been focused fairly heavily on Austin, and this is very Austin-centric, but anywhere else in Texas, or are we really the best at it?
Oh, of course, James, the best. No, I mean, obviously we have a very high concentration of firewise sites in the Travis County area. So proportionally, there's a lot of things happening just because there's so many sites here. Most recent examples, so last August, we had the Trails fire, which impacted the trails of Horseshoe Bay, which is actually one of our oldest, it's one of the oldest 3 firewise sites that they signed up the first year firewise sites could sign up nationally in Texas. They had a fire that was over 100 acres, and they've had a very vocal resident leader who the community loves, but she jokes about how, oh, they're gonna be so annoyed that they're gonna stop listening to me one day. And they had this fire, and everyone said it's because of this work that, you know, the community was designed with wildfire in mind when they originally platted things out. They have a trail system that goes through some green space that they specifically did some almost like shaded fuel break work along, and there were not even firefighters along that trail system. And in parts of it, you can see where the fire stopped right there next to the trail. Firefighters were able to get up close. People were able to evacuate safely. So that was a success story and a recent success story that's local. We also have, it's not quite as relatable, but the Mcdonald Observatory facility out in the Fort Davis Mountains is a firewise site and an 11-year firewise site now. And while some places just accidentally happen upon wildfire resilience practices, this is another place where they are taking very specific steps to address wildfire risk. Is owned by the UT system, so it's you know, a single landowner versus a multitude of individuals. But they have done a lot of massive investments when it comes to retrofitting buildings and managing their landscapes, preparing people. They have a lot of researchers who come and go. They might just be there for a few months. They might be there for a lot longer. So when they move in, they learn about wildfire risk and prevention tips. The Texas Forest Service is actually cooperating with them right now to do landscape restoration work along the base of the 2 mountains. If you're familiar, at the top of each mountain, if you're looking at it, it's a large saddle with telescopes on two hills. And around the base of those is just a large overgrowth of material. So the Lone Star State Hand Crew is going out there and doing landscape restoration work. So it's they have been very proactive.
Thank you, Carrie. Justice, being something of an expert in this field for just a few years. Anything you want to tag on to the end?
Yeah, something that's been extremely beneficial for us is Austin was selected to be the Texas representative for the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network that Annie helps facilitate and oversee. What that did is put us in a room and both virtually and physically with some of the best entities and agencies in the country that are conducting wildfire mitigation efforts. And so it provided opportunity for benchmarking against the best of the best in the wildland community. And we shamelessly take those best practices that we learn from other communities and implement them at the local level. But we also share what we're doing that's worked with other communities. So it's a great exchange, and I encourage everybody to check out the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network webpage. There's a lot of great feature information on Austin and other communities. One that really stands out is the community of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and one of our key partners to the network, Porfirio Chavarria. They were one of the early adapters that established a wildfire division and developed a fuels mitigation crew in conjunction with their fire adapted communities efforts. We looked at their crew as a model when we were establishing our fuels mitigation crew, and vice versa. We went through the process with Headwaters Economics along with Santa Fe to develop the first set of wildfire vulnerability viewers. So two of the first municipalities to integrate social justice and equity into the lens of wildfire preparedness. So there's too many to talk about today on the call, but I encourage you to take a deep dive into that network because it's reflective of all the leading edge of efforts across WUI communities in the country.
Thank you, Justice. And I will also shamelessly plug the Fire Adapted Learning Network that Annie works for. It is a fantastic resource. So moving on, the next question we have is that we haven't had a serious wildfire in Austin since 2011. And for many new Austin residents, that is before they ever arrived. What would you say to someone to help someone from the Northeast who has never seen a wildfire? Conversely, what would you tell someone from Southern California who is used to seasonal fires and struggles to relate the observable fire activity in the West that they were used to previously with the potential fire danger here? Sorry, Joyce, I think you're muted.
Okay. I would question whether the Southern Californians would not see the danger. I have two new neighbors, one on each side of me now, who have arrived in the last 6 weeks, each of them from California. And when I went over to talk with them about our Firewise community and give them the materials, they both looked down in the valley and said, yeah, we know. And then they explained to me what it was like to be in the smoke last year and how they really don't ever want to have that situation again. So they recognize, even though the trees may look different, they recognize that we are in a tough situation if there is ever a fire that's around us. We've also noticed that when we do the risk evaluations in the neighborhood, whenever we have a new California resident, they're the first ones to sign up for an evaluation and make sure that they've done everything they can in their Texas landscape. But for the folks in the Northeast, I think explaining to them that an ember storm is a lot like a snowstorm, except that you have the complication of heat and smoke. So I can remember growing up in Minnesota what it was like to be in a driving snowstorm, and you've got all this stuff blowing in your face, keeping you very cold. Well, imagine now that what you're going through is something that's got heat and smoke, making it impossible for you to breathe. And think about that as what could be arriving as a Texas wildfire. And so getting them to understand that our danger is from the embers that are going to be floating around and causing additional fire, and that they need to keep their homes very hardened so that they don't provide kindling for such fires. I think if you give them the image of the snowstorm, that might help. And then giving examples of where embers have caused great damage in this part of the country is probably another good thing. When we look at the Steiner Ranch fire and the homes that were lost there, those were not from walls of flame. Those were from embers, hopscotching all across the division, across the subdivision. And so being able to show people that, yes, embers are the danger, and you need to do something about making sure your home is hardened So you're not one of those that goes up in flames.
Thank you, Joyce.
I think the fact that we haven't had as many recent wildfires to as an example, and well, I should preface myself, as many catastrophic wildfires to point to. We have wildfires every year and throughout the year, but they usually don't make the news. But the basic understanding starts with that our landscapes aren't natural right now. A lot of people moving into these ecosystems across Texas think that when they look out the door, when they're buying that lot that's covered in whatever sort of vegetation it is, that that's natural, that it's perfect just the way it is, and that it doesn't need to change. And so then when we come in and talk about reducing the amount of vegetation you have, it is a very base contradiction with this idea that what is there is natural and beautiful. And so going back even before, let's not even talk about how many wildfires we have, but just talking about what a healthy ecosystem is. And healthy ecosystems create healthier water. Healthy ecosystems are more able to withstand pests and diseases and drought damage and these different things. So even going before the wildfire and just talking about ecosystem resiliency to whatever sort of damage could be incurred, that's where my conversations usually start with someone who's not familiar with our ecosystems.
That's a good point.
I think for us here in Austin, wildfire risk used to be relatively subjective, and especially before the development of the Texas A&M Forest Service Risk Assessment Portal and our localized risk assessment. Now our wildfire risk is scientific based. So I think our front line of awareness is showing people the science-based analysis and helping them come to their own conclusion. And that's a good first step, I think, for anybody wanting to understand how to address wildfire risk is begin by believing that it's an issue and let the science inform you.
Thank you, Justice. Well, I appreciate no one attempting a Southern Californian or Bostonian accent whenever talking about how they would talk to some of those people. So we will move on. Okay, when talking with community members, most people have an idea of a wall of flame destroying their homes. When teaching that it is embers that are of greatest concern, it becomes difficult to conceptualize. Kind of going into what Joyce had just said, the blizzard. What would you say at your level to put an ember storm into perspective and to elicit the appropriate response?
I actually had this conversation less than 2 weeks ago with someone, so it was very recent in my memory. I was teaching an internal course to some East Texas foresters, and we were able to go out to a private residence. It was basically a home ignition zone assessment course to some people who are already familiar with wildfires and the basic concepts of wildland firefighting. And the person whose home we were able to go to for our training was from Colorado. And her house sat maybe about 50 feet from the property line in the backyard, and right on the other side of the property line was just a large amount of mostly hardwoods, but some pine trees mixed in there with some really heavy understory vegetation. And she had agreed to let us all come out and walk around her house and her yard to talk about home ignition zone assessments. And she said that she was extremely worried about the potential of crown fire going through and bringing so much heat directly right next to her house. And of course, in East Texas, it's a little bit differently. Hardwood forests don't usually crown near as easy as, say, like a juniper forest. So there's that basic difference. But then, I had said, well, actually, I'm not sure if you're aware, embers actually cause most of our home loss across the United States, and specifically here in Texas. Even when there is a crown fire, embers can hit the house well in advance of the crown fire coming through. Or even if the home is there after, like during the Bastrop Complex fire, firefighters were patrolling the area. They said, check mark, that house is still there. And then an hour later, they'd come back and it wasn't there anymore. So embers are our main cause of home loss, even when we have ground fires. And, you know, this is why we talk about how they find little crooks and crannies, or wherever your leaves blow, your embers blow, and how they can build up over time and really create significant amounts of heat that just step ladder up to, unfortunately, your home burning down. It is a very base, I think, primal instinct to be afraid of ground fires. Obviously, they present a massive amount of risk to us as flesh and blood human beings. But we do have research that shows, and we do have our post-fire assessments that show that embers are the primary source. And especially now over the last 10 years, being able to point not just to firsthand accounts of firefighters, but actual research that shows us how our structures are impacted by immense amounts of radiant heat. It's usually just an opportunity to talk things through. Joy said it earlier, and I know where you got that phrase. It's Jack Cohen has the video that talks about, you know, especially the media present it in a way where it's these wall of fires destroying communities and sweeping, you know, tornado-like episodes. So it's usually just a basic conversation to, it's not necessarily a complex idea. It's just one that you don't really think about until you're presented with the opportunity to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Carrie.
There have been some videos taken too of the ember storms in a wildfire, and I think those are really impressive when you show them to a group of people who are thinking about this for the first time, because you don't usually think about that. You see on TV and other coverage the wall of flames. You don't often see the cloud of embers.
Thank you, Joyce. I'm also curious from Joyce, you as well, but specifically Carrie, Justice, and Annie, since y'all do have some of a background in active wildfire fighting, if there's any sort of information or example that you can take from that boots on the ground kind of experience and relate it to this?
I think Carrie mentioned this through, you know, our post-fire analysis with the Texas A&M Forest Service. In 2005, we documented the first confirmed structural loss associated with ember intrusion, and that changed the way our folks were considering structural protection operationally, and, you know, local fire departments. I think what people need to know is an ember storm will result in ignition in any receptive fuel bed. And so you can walk around a home with someone and talk about those elements of the home that are weak links that could lead to unnoticed ignition, and help them make that connection. Also in Austin, we made an effort to model the profusion of embers from open space areas into neighborhoods and receptive fuel beds. So there's ways from an analysis standpoint, you can quantify the potential impacts of embers. And that's one of the reasons why our Wildland Urban Interface Code extends ember protection way beyond what the code recommends as written, and out to 1.5 miles from these large open space islands that can generate embers. So there's a statistical way to analyze the impacts of embers from a wildfire standpoint. And there's also the intuitive conversation or anecdotal way of just talking about where your home might be susceptible to those embers landing and igniting.
And even in cases that are not wildfire, an example that I give people is a house fire in our neighborhood about 5 years ago, where the house next door had embers swept into the attic, and people fighting the fire at the house that was obviously on fire did not notice that. But it's the same issue of ember intrusion, which eventually gave that second home about $100,000 worth of damage when people finally realized there was fire in the attic. So it's the same ember issue going into the vents, the attic vents there, that we also talk about during a wildfire.
Well, and I
Great
think
point. Thanks, Joyce.
I think, at least in my area locally, one of the things that we've been able to do is point to real world experience here. In 2015, we had a wildfire impact a neighborhood. The structure loss in that neighborhood was about 30 homes. But more impactful from a financial perspective was the ember loft that then impacted 3 commercial structures over a mile from the site of the wildfire. And so the embers were lofted in the air, blew over into the warehouse district, found some receptive fuel materials adjacent to those large warehouses, and disrupted the economic engine of our community in a pretty significant way. And so from a conversation with policymakers and decision makers after that experience, we were able to say, this is what happened. We know how it happened. We know what the pathway to ignition was here. We had photos to show kind of indicating, much like the one you see on your screen, the quantity of embers that were lofted that day, and to really have a very concrete discussion about our experiences and what it would take to change that outcome moving forward. What kinds of structure hardening actions were necessary, in what places, and there's this sort of idea, I think, that folks have, and that you can draw a line on the map and say, once we're outside this area, this wildland urban interface area, we don't have any more risk. And really some of the efforts that Justice is talking about to model that ember intrusion and to extend that risk as a result of the ember casts are really critical, because the lines that we draw on a map are more permeable than we would like them to be. And so really having this conversation with those who are making those policy decisions about codes and ordinances and strategic planning and sort of the sideboards that govern at least our area has been advanced significantly by presenting that experience along with the data, marrying the story and the facts.
Thank you, Annie. And Justice, I'm going to pitch this one to you very quickly, since both you and Annie mentioned it. Is there, for those who aren't as aware of the Austin's new Wildland Urban Interface Code, is there a way you could put a very quick bow on it and explain to me as if I were a layperson?
Absolutely. So we know from years of research in the fire science community that the absolute best approach to mitigating human improvement losses or buildings or structures is through the hardening of those structures so they're resistant to ignition during a wildfire. That same research indicates that almost every home that ignites, any component of the home ignites during a wildfire, it most likely results in a total loss. And so the WUI code is an effort to mitigate any weak links associated with structure ignitability in the areas directly adjacent to our wildlands, and also protect those areas from embers. But we know if that front line, first row of homes don't ignite, then that can serve as a barrier or a buffer to keep homes and communities on the interior of a particular area. So know that once homes do ignite, they produce a tremendous volume and duration of embers. So having a WUI code that requires complete hardening adjacent to our open space areas, but also extends out into areas that aren't within direct proximity of our open space to require minimum ember protection to keep embers out of gutters and attics and underneath crawl space and all the nooks and crannies that embers find their way into and smolder and go unnoticed. So the WUI code has 2 components: structure hardening for that wall of flame that's mentioned that can occur, and also structure hardening to reduce the likelihood of embers from that fire or from a structure fire from spreading to adjacent structures and potentially initiating a conflagration. And that's what our fire history and fire science tells us in Austin, is our wildfires are just fuse for urban conflagration, which leads to structure ignition, which we absolutely want to avoid at all costs. So the code creates a buffer using communities and new communities to protect other areas in Austin. And what we're hoping is that we can expand the requirement for a WUI code compliance to a model of voluntary compliance where people see and understand the value of this code and want to implement it because it's the right thing to do to protect their property and their families.
Thank you, Justice. And to more than likely beat a dead horse, but for anyone who was curious, Wildland Urban Interface is shortened to WUI, and then we just sound it out because we love acronyms. So, woo-wee. All right. Our next question is, what is a shaded fuel break and how do they work?
Shaded fuel break is a treatment of vegetation, usually somewhere between 30 and 66 feet wide. Generally, it can be more or less than that, depending on the situation, but that is not designed to reduce the intensity of a wildfire. It is not designed to stop it. It is designed to slow it down, a wildfire, to slow it down and to decrease the flame length. So we are leaving well, you can have shaded and you can have unshaded. So shaded meaning that your crown is being left as intact as possible to provide shade to the bare mineral soil to reduce the amount of herbaceous material that regenerates after you leave. And there will still be the potential for fire to move through that fuels break, but it will do so with hopefully a flame length that is inches, if not only a few feet tall, instead of potentially individually torching trees or a crown fire moving through. So it's done to give firefighters more time to respond, to give residents more time to evacuate, and to, those are the main two things, to reduce intensity, to slow it down, give first responders and residents more time to react to that wildfire.
Thank you, Carrie.
Just to add to that, for us in Austin and Travis County, shaded fuel breaks aren't our frontline defense against wildfire. They're a complementary practice, and they're only effective largely when they're coupled with defensible space and structure hardening completed on adjoining properties. That's why whenever we can, we couple our shaded fuel break work with communities that are engaged in FireWise or the fire adapted communities efforts, because we know unto themselves they can create a false sense of security that it's been done to protect them is enough to protect their structure. And we know that's just not true because most of the shaded fuel breaks we create, as Carrie mentioned, are fairly narrow and embers can travel large distance. On the Steiner Ranch fire, it occurred on the north side of 620 and easily jumped a 4-lane highway and spotted across the landscape to reach homes. So we know they're most effective when they're coupled with structure hardening. And if we don't do both of those, both sides of the fence treatment, we're really giving people a false sense of security. What it can also do is help reduce the intensity of fires spreading from someone's backyard into and threatening our wildland areas. So there's a mutual benefit when these shaded fuel breaks are done appropriately. For us in Austin, that's defined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife best practices for shaded fuel break, coupled with our local best practices developed by Austin Water Utility, who manages most of our Balcones Canyonland wildlands in partnership with Travis County Balcones Canyons wildland. They're aggressively working with us to implement shaded fuel breaks adjacent to communities that are engaged in wildfire, because we know that's the perfect recipe for reducing risk.
Thanks, Justice.
And as Nate showed, you can track the progress of those on the hub. You can see where there is work planned to be done, where there is work being done. It's a massive opportunity that is going to take a lot of investment and time to be able to provide shaded fuel breaks around the FireWise community.
Yeah, I agree, Joyce. Thank you very much. Still to echo what Justice said, it is not an option to rest on your laurels. Don't let the fact that people are working to ensure your fire safety mean that you can take a nap on the couch.
Mm-hmm.
All right, for our next question, there has been some criticism of Smokey Bear lately, as some people feel his message about preventing wildfire creates the perception that all fire is bad. Do you think Smokey needs a new message?
Smokey does have a new message. It used to be only you can prevent forest fires, and now it's only you can prevent wildfires. And that was done kind of for a twofold reason. So the first off, recognizing that not all fire in the forest is bad, right? So it is not just forest fires that need to be prevented, but it's these wildfires, especially ones that accompany or appear in the WUI areas. And then the second reason for changing that word forest to wildfires is in recognition that wildfires happen in more than just areas that are traditional forests. If you've tried driving around the state with the Texas A&M Forest Service logo on your truck, you will without a doubt get the question, why are you out here? There's no forests here. Whether you're in Amarillo or San Angelo or, well, pretty much anywhere in between. So there's a lot of people who do take issue with Smokey Bear's message. He worked very, very well for very many decades, getting the message across that we need to be protecting our forests and our ecosystems. But I think a lot of the presentations that we do nowadays, at least I want to say within the last decade, Annie and Justice, you can correct me on that, but are usually accompanied with a conversation about good fire, bad fire, and small fires prevent, large fires, and those basic concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Carrie. And my apologies to the panel for putting you in the crosshairs of trying to talk down Smokey the Bear. I'd love it if he is.
Well, I mean, I would just point out that nationally, a significant proportion of our fires are still human caused. And so, in Washington State, where I live, we're at about 70 to 71% of our fires are human caused. In places nationally, that statistic is as high as 9 out of 10. And so there absolutely is still a role for the conversation about preventing ignitions at the wrong place and the wrong time and the wrong fuel types. I believe that we as a nation are capable of understanding nuanced messaging. And so I think it is very possible to talk about the need to prevent fires that are not going to be beneficial, either because of the fuel type that they are occurring in or the time of year in which they are occurring, and simultaneously talk about the need to restore fire to our ecosystem under the right conditions with the right people at the right time in a way that creates conditions that are more resilient later on. And so, I would argue that Smokey is still a really valuable part of our toolbox and a way to communicate with the public, certainly as a recognizable symbol of what it means to steward our landscapes. And that maybe we just need to, as Carrie was talking about, like broaden the conversation a little bit. And you see a great image of Smokey there utilizing a drip torch, which is an implement that firefighters can use to put good fire on the ground in the right way at the right time in the right place. And so, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It very much can be, we need to prevent fires while simultaneously restoring our forests in a way that often includes fire as a part of the conversation. So I'm a big Smokey fan, probably because of spending some time in the suit myself at one point, but I really do feel like he's an important part of our conversation.
Well, I wonder if he could be married with some of the attention that's being paid now to indigenous peoples and how their prescribed burn tactics over the centuries were good for the forests, and somehow get those images combined and promote smart use of small fires, as Carrie's been saying, use the small fires to prevent the big fires.
Hey, Joyce. I I'm going to bring a question in from the Q&A very quickly because it touches on my grandmother's area and the fact that my great uncle was one of the wildfire fighters who found Smokey the Bear. Anyway, Linda Haney would like to know how many people, and this is the panel, so how many people being 4, 3, 2, 1, are aware that there's currently a wildfire in the Lincoln National Forest where Smokey is from.
That's interesting.
And thank you, panelists, for going through this with us. I have one other question that we got from the chat that I would like to present to you. And it goes specifically to our community members. And then I will turn the floor back over to Chief Stewart. And the question is from Kirsten K. And she was wondering about how you would talk to your children about wildfires without scaring them.
So I have 3 children who you probably have heard at some point during this panel presentation of really different ages. I have a 13-year-old, an 8-year-old, and an almost 5-year-old. And there are some fantastic resources out there for talking to kids about wildfire. Ready.gov/kids is one, and I'll go ahead and drop that link into the chat. But in general, what I would say is that wildfire preparedness and preparation is something that we can do together as a family, and that I have found the best way to talk to my own children has been to do what the theme of this entire symposium is really about, and that is to empower them, to find ways to include them in our family preparedness actions in a way that are age appropriate. Maybe that is really different for my 13-year-old than it is for my 5-year-old. And so for my 5-year-old, I'm much more concerned about what would we need to do if there was an emergency, and make it a fun thing that we can practice to go to the neighbor's house or to set a meeting place. With my 13-year-old, we're having different conversations about ecological resilience and the role of fire on the ground because she's at a different place in her life. But really, in both cases, I'm trying to find ways that enable them to participate with us so that they have a piece of the solution. The same strategies that work in our communities also work in our families, right? An empowered family, and empowered kids, and empowered community, that's how we get closer to wildfire resilience and wildfire adaptation. And there are definitely great resources on ready.gov/kids that include coping mechanisms, disaster facts, activities for the whole family that kind of get to that in a way that may give you some ideas if you're looking for how you can prepare your own children for wildfire. But most important is to just start that conversation.
James, I would like to add to what Annie's point is. After the Bastrop fire, we worked with the National Fire Protection Association to do some research on the impacts of youth who are exposed to wildfire. And what we found out is the children that had the highest incidence of PTSD were those whose parents hadn't talked to them about the risk and the threat and their role. The children who are most resilient, their parents had that conversation. They had a role to play during a wildfire evacuation, and they understood the situation. So hiding it from them will not help them. It will actually hurt them. There's great ways to get children thinking about wildfire safety. Smokey is one of the most recognizable figures nationally, I think second to Mickey Mouse. Smokey's responsible for me being in the career that I am. Austin Fire Department developed a guide called Fire Adaptive Families Guide that helps outline how you can have that conversation and engage children or family members in preparing your home from wildfire in a way that's not scary, that hopefully is empowering and educating so they can be resilient to the impacts of a wildfire occur, because the incidence of psychological distress in children who aren't aware of the environment they live in is profound, and we want to avoid that at all costs. Bastrop has a generation of children who have a traumatic association with wildfire. And that's not the culture that we want to engender and create. We want to empower folks, and the way to do that is just like Annie says, have those conversations early.
Excellent.
Thank you, Justice. We do have about 1 minute left, so I just wanted to give Carrie and Joyce, you'll have the last words on this question, if you would like them.
Okay, well, my last word is, James, I think this is the topic for an upcoming newsletter. You could put together a newsletter that talks about educating kids and reference the study that Justice talked about, and I would be pleased to push that out to my neighborhood. We have lots and lots of kids.
Challenge accepted.
We certainly know. I mean, Texas, right up there with is it Florida and California, the most disaster-prone states in the country, the most national declarations of emergency, whether for county or statewide. So having those conversations, whether it be wildfire or ice storms, apparently, or flooding, or tornadoes, there's all sorts of different things that we need to be prepared about. Ready to go, wildlandfirersg.org has some preparedness tips. The same organization, NFPA, that does FireWise, has another program called Take Action, and that's for encouraging mostly teen-aged youth to literally take action in their communities, do mitigation work. So yeah, there's a lot of resources out there.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you to all our panelists, Carrie Hines, Joyce Statz, Justice Jones, and Annie Schmidt. We appreciate you so very much for coming and having this conversation with us. Chief Carrie Stewart, you are up next.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, James. And thank you, Joyce, for being here. And Justice and Carrie and Annie, I echo James' comments. That was an amazing panel. A lot of great information. I hope folks were able to take some notes, but we will be able to make the presentation available to you after today as well. That's going to take us into our final poll. So this one is about FireWise. Questions of, do you live in a FireWise community? If no or not sure, would you like to become a FireWise community? So we've got 2 minutes for that poll. So please participate in that one, and that'll kind of give us an idea of the folks that are in attendance today, how we're doing on our FireWise efforts. And while everyone's finishing up that poll, we're going to go over the resources. There were some questions in the Q&A about where do I find that website? Hopefully this slide will help with that. So our Wildfire Division Hub is on here, so atxwildfire.com. The Austin Travis County Wildfire Coalition site is listed here as well. The Texas A&M Forest Service site for preparing for wildfires. The Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network for Austin is listed here. Wildfirerisk.org for wildfire risk to communities. That's a USDA Forest Service site. The Austin Area FireWise Alliance. And then the NFPA Wildfire Preparedness Day site is up here too. So hopefully with the questions that were asked about, can you please list the resources? A lot of these are here on this slide. And when we send out an email to follow up from the symposium today, you'll get a copy of all of this and can refer back to this slide for that information. So we've got a few more minutes, a few more seconds for the poll. And thank you everyone for all of the questions that were put into the Q&A today. There was a lot of good information shared back and forth, a lot of good questions related to all areas of our panel discussion and all areas of the 2 larger presentations that we had in part 1 of the symposium. So thank you for all of the interactivity for today as well. All right, we're going to go over the results of that poll. And we've got the firewise.org website is listed there. So 25% said no, they are not a member or do live in a FireWise community. And 31% said if they were not sure or if no, that they would like to be. So please take advantage of those resources and the sites that we had, or contact us at the Wildfire Division in AFD. And there was also a question earlier about whether the virtual environment hampered or helped reaching people for this information. And just to give a little anecdotal piece of information, we had 138 people join us today. And with our last in-person event, we had less than 100. So we did a great job. So thank you everyone for joining us today and for being a part of our symposium. I think that speaks volumes to the interest that we have in being a fire adapted community as a whole, that we had so many people join us today and that it has been larger than our in-person events also. We'd like to thank all of our guest speakers and our panelists for joining us today. Thank you so much for the information you were able to share and for the great discussion that we had in part 2. As Chief Baker said, hopefully we'll be able to host this in person the next time and next year, but we're very grateful for all of the response and participation that we've had today. On this side, you'll also see that we are going to have a regular lunch and learn session as well. So to register for that, you can go to this and we'll be sending out an email as well so that you'll be able to register for those lunch and learns. We hope to see you there. And our first one will be May 12th from 12 to 1. And the topic will be protected fauna and flora of the Austin area. They mentioned James's newsletter as well during the panel discussion. So there'll be a way to subscribe to that newsletter and also a way to join Austin Firewise. So thank you all for being with us today. We hope that you've learned some information that you can take back to your communities to empower them for moving forward to be Firewise and to be a fire adapted community. And we hope to see you at those lunch and learn sessions soon. So thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.